Oh, wow, there's so much today already. It's so full, and it's just really good to be together and be a part of all of this. I feel like John, that, the kids were up here and we didn't have any animals, but we certainly had the kids, and so it's a really hard act to follow. There was already a lot of laughter and joy. And so I actually wrote down a couple of jokes before I start, because this is going to be it for humor today from me, right? Okay, ready? Ready? I thought this was funny. And if you don't, just laugh so I feel better, okay? Okay. Do you know why I don't like Velcro? Because it's a ripoff. Okay. One more. What do you call a fish with no eyes? Somebody said it. Get it? Yes. I thought it was really funny. Okay, anyway, ready? Ready for the sermon? Oh, okay. So we say yay for our graduates who have come full circle in their academic endeavors. And I was really honored. Pastor Rebecca and I joined me on a couple of these. We were really honored to congratulate all three of our graduates in person on their commencement day. I think all of them had lays up to here and beyond. And I don't remember when, but it was a long time ago. I remember I had an aha moment. I wanted to look up and see what commencement meant, because we call it commencement, but I was like, what does it really mean? And so it's a French word, and it means beginning. Even though we participate or we attend commencement to signify the end, right, of one's academic journey, our students are actually being released to a new beginning, and they've come full circle. Sorry, I have a glare, so I can't read as well here. Okay. So today, for our sermon, we have come full circle in our sermon series, Growing Courageous, on the book of Esther. And what looks like the end of the book has the same feel of a commencement with the Jewish Purim celebration that would commemorate their freedom and their deliverance from being annihilated or wiped out, right? They were saved. And this was an order that came from the king that was ruling at the time from the Persian Empire. So last week, if you were here, you were able to experience Wellspring's version of a Purim party when our youth, our keiki, they took over our worship service, and they did a phenomenal job in hosting us and actually teaching us from chapter 9 in Esther, where this Purim party all began. So in case you're just joining us for the first time, I'm going to apologize in advance because I have to give you the summary of this book, and we've been doing that for the last 9 weeks, right? Every time there's a summary. So I'm going to try to keep it interesting. But those of you who have heard the summary, thanks for your patience. But you kind of need it to understand, where we're going from here. So the book of Esther, it's a dramatic narrative, and it is fraught with themes of genocide and sexual exploitation and power gone bad and evil. And it's kind of like, in some ways the world that we live in today, right? But it is also a story of bravery and faithfulness and God's divine providence at work. We see the power and the timing and the mystery of God at work, though it is really perplexing that God is not mentioned in this book at all. In a mission to protect the Jewish people from being destroyed, God is very present to what is happening in the series of events that unfold, in the protection of his agents who are acting on his behalf, in the justice that prevails, in the outcome of the story. So the story takes place in the earlier part of the 5th century BC, and we have King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, depending on which version of the Bible that you are reading from. And he is a king who is destructive, and he is power hungry, and he is a glutton, lacking character. And when he banishes the initial Queen Vashti for her refusal to fulfill his command to parade naked with her crown in front of his party guests at a party that has lasted for days, he then banishes her. And then he decides to gather all the young women that he can find, and in this lengthy, really immoral way, he chooses one of them to be his new queen. And this is where God makes a way for Esther to enter into the picture, a sign that God is at work. Well, I have to do this. Yay! Yeah, I'm not going to do it the rest of the time. It's so noisy. Okay, his chosen queen is Esther, who is a young Jewish woman. And the other character in this is Mordecai, who is also a Jewish man, and he is actually the Hanai dad or adopted dad of Esther. And both Esther and Mordecai have to conceal their identity really to protect themselves and their people. And this is the Jewish people that have had to disperse, and they're in exile, and they're living in different communities. And one of the communities is this one area where the king is. So Queen Esther, she becomes queen, and then she leads a very sheltered and entitled, I think, life, right? She's really comfortable as a queen. And Mordecai, in the meantime, he is watching over Esther from outside the palace gates. And one day, this is where trouble starts. The king chooses a man named Haman to be his highest ranking advisor. Oh, you guys are so good. Wow, you guys are great. Okay, maybe we'll have fun yet. And Haman is a villain, and one day he becomes enraged because Mordecai refuses to bow down to him, right? And so while Haman wants to get rid of Mordecai, instead he has a bigger plan and says, rather than just Mordecai, let's get rid of all of the Jewish people, okay? And so he persuades the king to issue a decree that says we're going to kill all of the Jews. And the way that they decided how to kill them was this method of casting lots. And when they did that, the lot was drawn and said, it's going to take 11 months, but you have 11 months, and then that's when that would happen, okay? So time is on Mordecai and Esther's side, right? Because can you imagine if the lot were drawn and it said tomorrow or 1 week, right? So we see God is at work. And when Mordecai hears about this decree, he tells Esther, you have to go to the king and you have to plead on behalf of our people. But Esther is scared and she hesitates. And she says, well, there's a penalty for that. I could die. I can't go to the king unless he summons me. I can't ask him that. But Mordecai reminds her that she has been given this position of power for such a time as this, right? And she is the only one at this point that can really help to save the people. And eventually Esther becomes courageous enough to convince the king to save her people. God is with her, yay! And so she devises a plan, though, to do that. And so Esther invites the king and Haman to 2 private banquets. And the first banquet, Esther's sensing, not time to say anything yet. And so she waits and invites them to a second banquet. But in the meantime, the king can't sleep, right? He has insomnia. And so he ends up doing what we all do when we are trying to fall back to sleep. He gets a book, he gets the Royal Chronicles that keep record of all the events that have happened in this empire of his. And he discovers while he's reading, because it's probably a really big book, for some reason he turns to that page and he sees and discovers that earlier on it was Mordecai who saved his life when there was a threat upon his life. Okay, that's God at work. And so God steps in just in time, because then the king has this change of heart about Mordecai. And so he tells Haman, who really can't stand Mordecai, right, and wants to kill everyone, he says, I want you to publicly parade Mordecai through the city to honor him, right? And when Esther holds the second banquet, she's able to reveal her identity and also expose Haman's plot. And then Haman is executed, right? He's impaled on the same stick or whatever they call that for punishment, the same one that he actually built for Mordecai to be impaled on. It's used instead on him. God's justice is at work. Okay. So that sounds like the summary of the story, but there's one more problem that needs to be addressed. And that is, there's this decree to kill the Jewish people. And in Persian law, once a decree is issued, you cannot take it back. And so the king has to issue a second decree that allows the Jewish people to defend themselves. And with enough time to prepare, those 11 months, the Jewish people can put together a private army and they triumph over their enemies. God is at work for good. Yay! And Esther and Mordecai, they established what we call that annual festival of Purim to commemorate the relief and the survival of their people. It's a Purim party. And that feels like it should be the end of the story. But here we are. There's a chapter 10. Right? So what more could there be? The party is over. The Jewish people are saved. What now? And similarly, when you look at this season that we're in, this is a season for us where there's many, many celebrations, especially in the summer, right? And there's many conclusions. We celebrate graduates from high school and college and trade schools, and we celebrate even our keiki, right, as they move up into another Sunday school class. And graduation oftentimes feels like a lot of other big events in our lives. There could be weddings, there could be anniversaries, there could be retirements, there could be even celebrations of life. When we remember someone that's passed, we celebrate victory journeys of all sorts, whether it's our own or someone else's journey. You and I step into celebration mode, right? And then you're in it and you blink, and just like that, the celebration is over. Have you felt like that before, right? Those of us who have planned some big events, and then just like that, it's over. And that doesn't mean it wasn't the best party or gathering, but it begs the question afterwards, so what's next? Life settles down again. What's next? And that's where we meet Mordecai and the king of the Persian Empire in this final chapter of Esther. So follow along with me as I read from Esther 10 from the NIRV version. So King Xerxes required people all through his kingdom to bring gifts. King Xerxes required gifts from its farthest shores. All the king's powerful and mighty acts are written down. That includes the whole story of how important Mordecai was. The king had given him a position of great honor. All these things are written in the official records of the kings of Media and Persia. The position of Mordecai the Jew was second only to the position of King Xerxes. Mordecai was the most important Jew. All the other Jews had the highest respect for him. That's because he worked for the good of his people, and he spoke up for the benefit of all the Jews. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So how many of you have read a book or you watched a TV show or a movie, and when it comes to the end, it's not the grand ending that you hope for, right? You're kind of disappointed, and you conclude thinking, that's it, right? I'm sure you can think of some instances. But sometimes if you're lucky enough, you might get the sequel, right? Another sequel to a movie, or another renewal of season for a TV show, or you might get an epilogue to the book that you are reading. And that's how I see this final chapter of Esther. The party is over, and now the realities of life begin again. Sadly, graduates, that's kind of what's going to happen after the parties, yeah. And here's where we see the fruits of Mordecai's journey, and that's God's sovereignty that has prevailed in this passage. Interestingly, Esther, we don't hear about her in this passage, right? She's absent. But I just want to mention that we know from the story that she has been a necessary part to the story of courage and faithfulness. In 3 short verses here, the book of Esther tells us what's next now. So in the first few verses, it sounds like, when you look at it, it sounds like the king has issued another decree to the people as far as Persia's farthest shores to bring gifts. And some of your Bibles, it may translate as imposing tribute on the land, and others refer to it as a tax. However you frame it, we can see here that the king issued a decree or an edict. And so we see the power and the influence still of this king's rule. And this particular information serves to help us understand that decisions such as these were included in this large book as the king's powerful and mighty acts, and they were written down in the records. And then they would be passed down. And so it says then there's Mordecai, who is mentioned for his importance now that he held a position second only to the king. He was, in that time, the most important Jew before Jesus, respected by all the other Jews. Who would have thought that this man who stood outside the gates of the palace, one of the Jews living in exile, unseen, unacknowledged, and simply advising Queen Esther, would be able to help Esther elevate herself to a position of advocating to save her people? Yet Mordecai's story was important enough to make it into the king's record book of things to be known and passed down. And what a significant turn. Oh, pages are mixed up. Turnaround for a king who has begun the story as a foolish, greedy partier, right? Who had very little redeeming character, but he now, I think we see for the first time, he started to choose wisely when he makes Mordecai his second in command. God is still at work, as this promotion is the way that Mordecai can continue to watch over and protect his people with the help of God. Mordecai's faithfulness is seen and it's rewarded, and it reinforces his conviction to follow a God who is never mentioned but is right there with him, as he is with each of us. The faithfulness of Mordecai and of God has come full circle. So full circle faithfulness, it describes God's unshakable, relentless commitment to complete what he has started in our individual and community life. And that could mean a calling or a promise or something that involves a long and hard journey of challenges, sometimes detours, and sometimes delays. And in these times of hardship or long journeys, God will call us back, reminding us to reclaim us to our true purpose, to help recover and to restore us, so that we can continue to fulfill whatever it is that he intended for us to do in the first place. Whether that be finishing school, or helping someone through a long or terminal illness, working on a team where it's really hard and maybe there's room for improvement. Sometimes even after it's all done, there's not even a celebration. But the full circle of faithfulness, it never ends. It begins again and again and again. And once it is complete in time, God will likely, right, call us to a new purpose or a task as he continues to build a relationship with us and mature us to be better servants and leaders to him and to one another. I know I was so sure after I finished my years of seminary last year that I would have much less on my plate, right? But sometimes, and maybe it just looks a little different. We kind of pushed all the things around, but sometimes I feel like the speed on my circle of faithfulness is 50 miles per hour rather than the 10 miles per hour that I would really hope for it to be. And each challenge or circumstance, though, that I'm dealing with on my circle, it may be difficult. Yes, it probably causes me to complain a lot. But each circle is a part of my own formation, each time going round, and the transformation. And that is a lifelong process of being a follower of Christ. We are called as believers to be faithful to God. And that is a continuing endeavor on our part. That is the what's next, friends, and in particular to our graduates. Our lives are about continuously being open to growth that mirrors the heart of Jesus. Jesus had yet to make his debut on earth when Esther and Mordecai were around, but they knew a God who was more powerful and principled than King Xerxes, and a God who promised to love those who loved him. Our final chapter in Esther reminds us of God's full circle of faithfulness that never abandons and will only be remembered if the stories of faithfulness are passed down from generation to generation. So here are the two lessons from this chapter when we open the door to full circle faithfulness. I'm going to give them to you all at once. Number one is to be devoted and responsive to God. Be devoted and responsive to God just as he is to his people. And we've seen that with Mordecai and Esther. And number two is to be an intentional part of God's story of salvation and goodness. Don't sit back if there's something or some way that God is asking you to participate. Your life stories bear witness to God at work. Your testimonies, your life stories bear witness to God at work. Verse 3 says, all the other Jews had the highest respect for him, Mordecai. That is because he worked for the good of his people. And when we look at Mordecai, we see him as a man of integrity and wisdom and faithfulness who acted only for the good of others and was prompted by a higher power, especially in times of trouble. Mordecai's devotion to God reflected God's own covenant devotion in response. And although God is hidden and unseen, he is certainly not absent. It is evident that God is at work because things happened in this story that wouldn't normally happen. Remember the summary that I started with? Do I need to go through it again? So you remember the summary, things we might call, right? Sometimes we do this. Oh, I'm so lucky, right? Or coincidences. These are actually divine providence. The things that you see happening that are unusual but are in favor of God's people. Only God could have the power to have intervened so many times in such drastic ways in this story, creating an opportunity for Esther to become queen, giving Mordecai enough access to Esther so he could continue to walk with her, drawing the lot that would give Mordecai and Esther 11 months to prepare for battle, causing the king to have insomnia and then having him read that part of the Chronicles that talked about Mordecai saving his life. And then there's the triumph of the Jewish people. Mordecai and Esther were intentional about using their influence for the good of God's people to participate well in God's story. What opportunities has God placed before you to seek the welfare of others, especially those who have yet to know Jesus? What opportunities has God placed before you to seek the welfare of others, especially those who have yet to know Jesus? We are counting on you, the younger generation. Being a faithful responder is about knowing when and where we have agency to act on behalf of God, desiring to do something good for his people. Mordecai and Esther could have said no many times, and they said it to each other, but not to God. Mordecai's responsiveness to God eventually elevates him to power that is used not for evil, but for good, to protect, to intercede for his people. And although King Xerxes could be seen as a corrupt politician or leader, Mordecai became his highest official on the inside to continue to work for the good of God and not for the king. Just as God has made a covenant with Abraham way back not to abandon his people, we see the same with Mordecai and Esther, choosing to be faithful, to advocate for the lives of those who were powerless to do so themselves. Their devotion and their responsiveness to God drew devotion and responsiveness from God also. And the Word is filled with many other examples of this. First and foremost, there's Jesus, a Jew, who walked among the poor, the unseen, and the forgotten, but eventually ascending to reign at the right hand of God. And then there's Joseph from the Old Testament, who provided for his people during the famine. And like Mordecai, he had to conceal his identity to accomplish God's purpose for his life in order to rise up to help God's people. All examples of devoted responders to God. We know Mordecai's story because someone found it worthy to share how God worked in his life. Verse 2 says, all the king's powerful and mighty acts are written down. That includes the whole story of how important Mordecai was. So can you imagine if nothing were ever written? How would we know what happened or what kind of man Mordecai was and how God was at work? The story of Esther could have been told very differently, but it was important enough to remember that God, through Mordecai and Esther, saved the Jewish population even when they were in exile, and that God's faithful covenant prevailed over everything. That Mordecai is a servant who reflects God's heart. The story has been told, and it reflects God's devotion to his people and his responsiveness to those who follow him. It is a story of salvation and goodness, which is what testimonies are when we share them with one another. They encourage us, they move us, they grow us, and they remind us. They have the power to reach those we never would have expected. Last week, when Jedi Kalua gave his testimony here, and I encourage you, if you didn't hear it, we do have it uploaded. There were so many people that were paying attention. There were so many people that responded because they were completely drawn in and moved by this young man's life story. And they saw Jedi's faith as he shared about encountering struggle, the people in his life who shaped him, his grandmas, and how God reached him in a very vulnerable moment in his life. And that's the power of stories. We've shared life stories from some of you over the last year, and realizing the value and the power that these stories have to teach and reach and allow you to get to know one another. Expect more to come as early as next week. So this last chapter, it may not answer some burning questions that you have, like, what happened to Esther? How long did Mordecai serve the king? Or maybe I'm the only one asking these questions, but we don't know everything. But what is worthy in our stories is sharing what God did in the lives of those who needed rescuing, recovery, and renewal. You may not think so, but each of you has a story witnessing to the power of God at work in your life. You become an intentional part of God's story when you become a believer. And there are many more stories to follow as you open yourself up to allowing God to form and transform you. So please take a moment this week to take a look at the reflection questions and give some time to them this week. I don't think they're easy. I think they're pretty challenging, but that's not a bad thing. I encourage you to ask yourself, where have you seen God's hidden hand at work in your own life, guiding, protecting, or providing in ways you only recognize perhaps in hindsight. And I highly encourage you to write out or share your story about this particular experience. Your life story matters because you matter to the one who created you. Let's pray. Creator God, just as you are present and working in the lives of so many who have come before us, we know you continue to work in our lives for good. Help us to be devoted and responsive to you, open to the Holy Spirit that moves mysteriously but magnificently. And thank you for the examples of Esther and Mordecai to witness to us your power and your presence, even when we cannot see or hear you. We cannot even begin to express our gratitude for how much you are devoted to us as broken people, and that you love us anyway. Help us to be intentional in life experiences, participating well, journeying courageously, and celebrating more times of full circle faithfulness that strengthens and prepares us for what's next in our life that is shared and dependent on you, Holy God. We love you. Amen.